$95 million. That is the total prize money on the line at the tournament Alex Eala is about to walk into. The biggest purse in the history of tennis. Now here is what should stop you in your tracks. Out of hundreds of players chasing a piece of that money, there is one specific spot waiting just for her. Standing right next to her in that spot is a man ranked number 4 in the entire world. So ask yourself this: why would a top 4 ranked player, someone who has already made millions, someone who does not need the exposure, choose to pair up with a 21-year-old who only had her first tour-level win a few weeks ago? That is not a normal pairing. That is not luck. That is not a coincidence handed out by a random draw. Something happened before this ever got announced. Something in the way Eala has been playing, the way crowds have been reacting to her, the way tournament directors keep scheduling her matches during peak hours, that made this pairing make sense to people who do not make decisions lightly. And once you understand what led to this moment, you are going to see why this is not just one more match on one more court. This might be the single biggest opportunity of her entire career so far. But to understand why, you cannot start with the money. You cannot start with the ranking. You have to start with where this all began. Because the gap between where Alex Eala came from and where she is standing right now is bigger than almost anyone realizes. Here is who Alex Eala actually is, and why this moment matters more than it looks like on the surface. She is from the Philippines. Think about that for a second. A country with over 100 million people, passionate about basketball, passionate about boxing, but never, not once, producing a true global tennis star. No blueprint, no senior player to call for advice. No proof that the dream was even possible. As a kid, Eala left home to train at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Spain. A young girl, alone in a new country, learning a new language, chasing something that had never been done before by anyone from where she came from. No guarantee, no safety net, just a bet on herself that could have easily gone nowhere. For years, that bet did not pay off in any obvious way. She grinded through lower-level pro tournaments most casual fans have never heard of. Small prize money, no television cameras, a ranking that crept up slowly, the way it does for almost every player who eventually makes it, but also the way it does for hundreds of talented juniors who never break through at all. Here is why that matters. Every single one of those quiet years happened while she was also carrying something most young athletes never have to carry. She was not just building a career. She was trying to prove that a Filipino tennis player could actually compete on the biggest stages in the sport. That is not pressure that goes away when the cameras are off. That follows you into every practice session, every small tournament, every lonely night far from home, wondering if any of it is going to work. And this year, the numbers finally started catching up to that pressure. She has played more matches than any other woman on the entire WTA Tour, 56 of them and counting. She climbed to a career-high ranking near number 18 in the world. She built a 9-4 record against top 10 opponents, 7 of those wins coming this year alone. Every one of those numbers represents a moment where a young woman from a country with zero tennis tradition had to prove over and over again that she belonged. So when you hear that a world number 4 player wants her standing next to him at a tournament worth $95 million, that is not charity. That is someone recognizing a level of performance that took years of invisible sacrifice to build. But here is the part that makes this story so much more complicated than a simple rise to the top. Because just months before any of this happened, there was a moment that made all of it look like it might never come together at all. This is not the story of a smooth climb. And one moment earlier this year proves exactly how close it came to falling apart. Rewind to January. The Australian Open. Eala was set to make her main draw debut at a Grand Slam for the very first time. This was supposed to be the moment everything clicked into place. Hundreds of fans showed up hours before the gates opened, lining up all the way toward Rod Laver Arena just to watch a young Filipina player step onto that stage for the first time. Here is the mini question worth sitting with. What happens when a moment built up that big does not go the way anyone hoped? She lost straight sets to Alicia Parks. The fans who had waited in line since sunrise had to watch their long-anticipated milestone slip away in real time. No fairy tale debut, no signature win to point to. Just a hard, quiet exit from the biggest stage in tennis. Layer that with something even bigger. Think about what it actually means to be the first. When established stars lose a match, they lose inside decades of history their country has already built in the sport. When Eala loses, there is no cushion like that. Every setback risks becoming the headline instead of a footnote in a much longer story. And that pressure did not stay contained to one bad afternoon in Melbourne. It followed her into every tournament after that. Every match against a ranked opponent became a referendum on whether the hype around her was real or whether it had simply outpaced what she could actually deliver on the biggest courts. Now stack a third layer on top of that. Because rising expectations do not slow down just because a young player is still figuring things out. As her ranking crept up over the following months, the scrutiny did not ease off. It intensified. Every win got measured against the idea that she still had not proven herself at the level that actually matters, the Grand Slam level. The level where that Australian Open loss still lingered in the background of every conversation about her. So picture where that leaves her. A player carrying the weight of being her country's first real hope in tennis. A debut at the sport's biggest stage that ended in disappointment instead of celebration. A media narrative quietly waiting to see if that loss was a preview of a ceiling rather than a speed bump. If you are only looking at the surface, this does not look like the beginning of a story that ends with a top 4 ranked player asking to stand next to her at a $95 million tournament. This looks like a young athlete who might spend years trying to close the gap between potential and proof. And then something happened that changed the entire trajectory in a matter of weeks. Something that turned every one of those doubts completely upside down. Here is the part almost nobody connects. And once you see it, the whole picture flips. Everyone assumes a rough Grand Slam debut like that Australian Open loss becomes the ceiling a young player has to fight against for years. More doubt equals slower growth. More scrutiny equals more hesitation on the biggest points. That is how it is supposed to work for a 21-year-old still trying to prove she belongs. But flip that assumption, because what actually happened next tells a completely different story. Just months after that quiet exit in Melbourne, Eala walked into the Mubadala DC Open and did something no Filipino player had ever done. She won the whole tournament. Not just won it, she came back from a set-down in the final against the tournament's top seed in a match delayed by rain and stretched into a second day, and closed it out by winning the last 9 games in a row. Here is the twist. That loss in Australia was never actually a ceiling, it was fuel. The same pressure that looked like it might crush her instead became the exact thing that sharpened her when it mattered most. And here is where it gets even more interesting. Because winning that title did something that goes far beyond one trophy. It put her on the radar of people who do not make casual decisions, tournament directors who started scheduling her matches during peak hours because they knew crowds would show up, and management teams who started seeing her not as a promising junior anymore, but as a genuine draw. Think about what that actually means for the pairing at the center of this whole story. Felix Auger Aliassime did not just randomly get matched up with Eala for the U.S. Open mixed doubles wildcard. Their representation teams share the same agency. The people around both players connected the dots after watching exactly what happened in the months following that Australian Open loss. The title run, the wins over ranked opponents, the crowds that kept getting louder every single tournament. So the assumption you probably walked into this video with, that a rough Grand Slam debut spells trouble for a young player's momentum, gets completely reversed here. That loss in Melbourne was not the story. It was the setup for the real story. The one where a single breakthrough title turned a promising but unproven player into someone elite competitors actively want standing next to them at the sport's biggest event. But knowing that connection exists is one thing. Seeing exactly how deep it goes and what it means walking into a $95 million tournament is where this story gets even more convincing. Let's put everything next to each other, because once you see it laid out together, the picture becomes impossible to argue with. Start with the timeline. January, a straight sets loss in her Grand Slam debut at the Australian Open. August, barely 7 months later, a maiden WTA title at the Mubadala DC Open, won by battling back from a set down against the tournament's top seed and closing it out with 9 straight games. That is not a slow, steady climb. That is one of the fastest turnarounds from disappointment to breakthrough that women's tennis has seen in years. Now put that next to what came after the title. Wins over Naomi Osaka. Wins over Elina Svitolina. A career-high ranking climbing to number 18 in the world. 56 matches played this season, more than any other woman on the entire WTA Tour, which means 56 separate decisions by tournament organizers to put her on court, in front of crowds, during the hours that matter most. Now bring back the wildcard pairing, because this is where the loop closes completely. Remember the question from the start of this video. Why would a world number 4 player choose to stand next to a 21-year-old with one tour-level title to her name at a tournament worth $95 million? Here is your answer, laid out piece by piece. Auger Aliassime and his team did not make that decision in a vacuum. They watched a player go from a quiet Grand Slam exit in January to one of the hottest storylines in tennis by August. They saw the crowds. They saw the wins over ranked opponents. They saw a scheduling pattern that proved tournament directors were already betting on her. Here is the insight that ties this whole story together, the one most people watching from the outside completely miss. This wildcard was never about charity or convenience. It was a calculated read of momentum made by people whose careers depend on getting those reads right. When your own management team and a top 4 players' management team, sharing the same agency, decide to build a pairing around you, that is not luck. That is confirmation that what happened between January and August was real, not a temporary hot streak that would fade the moment the spotlight got bigger. And that brings the money back into focus. $95 million is not just a number that makes headlines. It represents the biggest stage tennis has to offer. The loudest crowds, the most cameras, the most pressure. Walking into that environment with a proven partner, a built-in platform, and a story the entire tennis world is already watching is not a small opportunity. It is the exact kind of moment careers get defined by. So now you understand why this pairing happened, why it happened now, and why it is not an accident. What is left is what this could actually mean once she steps onto that court in front of the largest audience of her career. So let's go back to that number we opened with, $95 million, and one specific spot inside that tournament that belongs to Alex Eala. Now you know exactly why it exists. A quiet, painful exit at her first Grand Slam in January did not become the ceiling everyone assumed it would. It became the starting point for one of the fastest turnarounds in recent tennis history. A breakthrough title in Washington. Wins over ranked opponents that kept piling up. Crowds that grew louder every single tournament. And a wildcard pairing built by people who do not gamble on momentum that is not real. That is the answer to the question this video opened with. A top 4 ranked player is not standing next to Eala because of charity. He is standing next to her because every signal, from the scoreboard to the schedule to the stands, pointed to the same conclusion. This is a player worth betting on. And here is what makes this even bigger looking forward. In just a few weeks, that partnership steps onto a court at Flushing Meadows, inside the largest purse in tennis history, in front of the loudest, most unpredictable crowd the sport has anywhere in the world. Everything we just walked through, the comeback, the wins, the calculated bet 2 management teams made on her future, all of it gets tested on the biggest stage tennis can offer. Does this become the moment Alex Eala's name moves from rising story to established star? Does a Grand Slam crowd in New York respond to her the same way crowds did in Washington and Cincinnati? Nobody knows yet. Not the tournament organizers, not the broadcasters, not even Eala herself. So if you want to see exactly how this plays out, This is not a story you want to walk into blind. Subscribe now, because when that match happens, we are breaking down every point of it and finding out together whether this was the beginning of something historic or just one more step in a journey that is still writing itself.